The room is dark. The only light comes from a candle's flame and the pale glow of the moon outside the window. On the desk before us lies a book. Its leather is cracked, its pages yellowed with age. This is not the kind of book you'll find in libraries, nor on the shelves of scholars. It is a book of fears, of warnings, a book filled with the stories people told when the fire burned low and the night pressed close against their walls. As we open it, the smell of dust and earth rises. And on the first page, written in faded ink, is a single word: vampire. For as long as people have buried their dead, they have feared that the grave might not hold them, that the body might rise again, restless, hungry, thirsting for the living. But in the 18th century, in a small Serbian village called Medvegia, these fears became something far more terrifying. A soldier named Arnold Paole had returned home haunted, claiming he had once been cursed by a vampire in Greece. When he died, the village buried him, and yet, weeks later, people swore they saw him again. What followed was the first vampire epidemic ever recorded. An outbreak of hauntings, deaths, and exhumations so alarming that Austrian officials filed detailed reports describing the dead as though they were alive. The vampire was no longer just a tale, it had become a case file. Before we turn the page and begin, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark myths, forgotten histories, and strange legends are worth remembering, if you believe the shadows of our past should not be left to silence, then you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing to the Midnight Archives. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep opening these files, from folklore and history to the occult and the unknown. Tonight, we open the file. We will follow the trail of Arnold Paole, from his mysterious death to the exhumations that shocked his neighbors, from the panic that swept across Medvegia to the reports that spread fear through all of Europe. This is not just the story of a man. It is the story of how the vampire, the most enduring monster of all, was born. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. The early 18th century was a difficult time to be alive in the borderlands of Europe. The village of Medvegia, tucked into the rugged countryside of what is now Serbia, was not a place of wealth or comfort. It lay under the rule of the Habsburg Empire, but the empire's reach was thin here. Borders shifted with wars against the Ottoman Turks. Soldiers marched through, fields were trampled, and villages were left to rebuild with what little they had. Life in Medvegia was harsh. Winters were long and unforgiving. Food was scarce. A family might spend months preparing for the cold season, only to see their stores rot or their livestock taken by disease. Wolves and boars prowled the forests, but the greater dangers were the ones invisible to the eye: fevers, plagues, and infections. A small cut could become fatal. A cough could spread through a family in a week. Death was not distant. It was an everyday companion, and death shaped the landscape. Every village had its church, and beside it, the graveyard. These graveyards were not like the manicured cemeteries we know today. Graves were shallow, coffins simple, often nothing more than rough wooden boxes nailed together hastily. The soil was hard and cold in winter, so bodies were sometimes placed in graves that barely covered them. The poor were buried with little ceremony, sometimes with nothing but a prayer and a cross. For the people of Medvegia, the graveyard was not only a place of mourning, it was a place of fear. the dead did not always stay quiet. Across Eastern Europe, a common belief persisted. Some people, when they died, did not truly rest. They became what villagers called the restless dead, revenants who clawed their way out of the earth to trouble the living. These beings were not yet the elegant, caped vampires of modern imagination. They were something closer to corpses animated by hunger and spite. Who became a revenant? The answer varied, but certain deaths carried danger: a violent death, a suicide, a person who had not received proper last rites, a stranger buried in foreign soil. Even the unbaptized could be suspected. Such people were thought to rise again, wandering by night, feeding on livestock or sapping the strength of their neighbors. To prevent this, villagers used rituals: a stone pressed onto the chest of the corpse, or a sickle placed across the throat to keep it from rising, a coin placed in the mouth to keep the jaws shut. Sometimes the head was removed and placed between the feet. In extreme cases, the heart was pierced with a stake. These measures sound brutal to us today, but to the people of Medvegia, they were acts of protection. The line between superstition and survival was thin. When a family began to waste away one by one, when livestock sickened and fields failed, it was not enough to say, "We don't know why." Fear demanded an answer, and often that answer lay in the grave. It was into this world that Arnold Paole lived. We know little about him, except that he had once been a soldier. Like many men of his region, he served in the Habsburg army, fighting far from home in lands scarred by conflict with the Ottoman Turks. At some point in his travels, Paole claimed to have encountered something worse than soldiers or wars. While stationed in Greece, he said, he had been attacked by a vampire. In the Greek tradition, this creature was called the Vrikolakas, a bloated, ruddy corpse that wandered villages at night. The Greeks believed the Vrikolakas spread its curse through its bite or even through contact with its grave. Paole told his neighbors that he had felt the curse upon him, but he also claimed he had taken steps to free himself. He had eaten earth from the vampire's grave. He had smeared himself with its blood. To his mind, this ritual had broken the bond and saved his life. For the villagers of Medvegia, this was not reassuring. It was alarming. To them, Paole was a man who had brushed against death, who had carried a curse back across borders. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a man marked by the touch of the vampire. Imagine what it meant to live beside him, to share fields, to pass him at church, to watch him walk the same roads as you. Would you trust his word? Would you believe the curse was gone? Or would you whisper that he was no longer entirely one of you? Sometime in the 1720s, Arnold Paole's story reached its first end. He died suddenly, in what was described as an accident. A fall from a wagon broke his neck. It was not war or sickness that claimed him, but a simple misstep. His body was taken to the churchyard. A shallow grave was dug. The villagers placed him in the earth, spoke the prayers, and covered him with soil. In a village where death was common, Paole's passing might have seemed ordinary. Another man gone, another grave added to the rows beside the church. But beneath the surface, unease lingered. This was not just any man. This was Arnold Paole, the soldier who had spoken of vampires, who had admitted to smearing himself with their blood. For years, he had lived with suspicion hanging over him. And now he was gone. One might expect relief, but relief did not come. Because in Medvegia, death was never certain. In the weeks after Paole's burial, whispers began to spread. Some said they had seen him at night, pale and uncanny, moving along the roads. Others said he had come to their door, knocking softly in the dark. And when those people fell sick and livestock were found dead in their pens, the village was left with only one conclusion. Arnold Paole was not at rest. And in Medvegia, death was not the end, it was the beginning. The death of Arnold Paole should have been the end of the story. A man dies, he is buried, and the village moves on. That is how it was meant to be. But in Medvegia, the grave did not stay closed. At first, it was only whispers. A farmer returning late swore he had seen Paole walking at the edge of the fields. A woman claimed she had glimpsed him by the churchyard, his figure pale in the moonlight. The details shifted from one account to another, but the story was the same. Arnold Paole was seen after death. The villagers tried to explain it away. Perhaps it was someone else. Perhaps grief had clouded their eyes. But then the livestock began to die. Cows were found lying stiff in their stalls with no sign of disease or predator. Chickens dropped dead in their coops, sheep wasted away. Soon after, people too began to fall ill. They grew pale and weak, their strength drained away over the course of days. No cure seemed to help, and most terrifying of all, some of them claimed that Arnold Paole had come to them at night. One man told neighbors that Paole had stood at his window, staring in. Another swore that Paole had pressed down on his chest in the dark, choking him. Within days, both men were dead. In a community already primed to believe in revenants, these stories were not doubted. They were confirmation. Fear in a village is like a spark in dry grass. It spreads quickly. The villagers began to watch the roads at night. They barred their doors and carried charms against the dead. When dogs barked in the dark, they wondered if Paole was near. And when sickness struck, it was no longer seen as illness. It was seen as proof. The vampire was feeding. Families whispered to each other in secret. But secrets do not last long in a place as small as Medvegia. Soon, the entire village was gripped by fear. No one could feel safe, while Paole's grave lay untouched. From the villagers' perspective, the answer was simple. They believed that Paole had become a vampire because of his connection to one in Greece. The curse had followed him home, and if he was feeding on the living, then the cure was clear. He had to be exhumed. Exhumation was not unusual in such cases. Across Eastern Europe, there are countless records of villagers digging up suspected vampires. Reports describe bodies that looked fresh, with blood at the mouth, their skin ruddy instead of pale. These signs, they believed, proved the corpse was active, leaving the grave at night, returning with the blood of its victims. For us, with modern understanding of decomposition, these details make sense. The gases of decay can cause bloating, pushing fluids through the mouth and nose. Skin can darken. Hair and nails appear to grow as the flesh shrinks back. To them, these were not signs of rot. They were signs of life. But the villagers of Medvegia didn't have our knowledge. What they had was fear. The decision was made. By torchlight, the villagers gathered at the churchyard. The earth above Paole's coffin was dug away. The coffin was opened. What they found inside was more terrifying than anything they had imagined. Paole's body was not decomposed. His skin was ruddy, almost lifelike. His eyes seemed to glisten. And worst of all, his mouth was stained with blood. The villagers recoiled. For them, there could be no doubt. This was the proof. Arnold Paole was a vampire. They acted quickly. A sharpened stake was driven into his chest. Witnesses later claimed that the corpse groaned as the wood pierced it. Afterward, the body was dragged from the coffin and burned to ash. The village, they believed, was free. For a brief time, life seemed to return to normal. The animals stopped dying. The sick began to recover. People allowed themselves to hope that it was finished. The vampire had been destroyed. But fear is not so easily silenced. And in Medvegia, the deaths did not stop. In the weeks that followed, more villagers fell ill. Livestock again began to die. This time, there was no Arnold Paole to blame. He had been burned to ash. But the villagers had an explanation. Paole, they believed, had fed before his body was destroyed. He had passed on the curse. Others had risen from their graves. The vampire epidemic was not over. It was only beginning. By now, fear had consumed the entire village, and once again, the people of Medvegia turned to the graves for answers. They would dig deeper, they would open more coffins, and what they claimed to find inside would spread fear across all of Europe. At first, the villagers felt relief. The vampire was gone. The body of Arnold Paole had been staked, burned, and scattered to ash. But the relief did not last. Within weeks, sickness returned to the village. Families wasted away. Livestock collapsed in their pens. And with every new death, the whispers grew louder. Paole had not been the only one. His curse had spread. According to later reports, Paole had fed on several villagers before his body was destroyed. In doing so, he had passed on his condition. His victims, in death, would become vampires themselves. This was the logic of Medvegia. The curse could spread like a plague. Kill one vampire, and 4 more might rise. Destroy those, and more could still appear. And so, the deaths were not seen as natural. They were proof that Paole's shadow still lingered. His victims had joined him. The villagers faced an impossible truth. They had already dug up one grave. They would have to do it again. By torchlight, the villagers returned to the churchyard. This time, they exhumed not one coffin, but several. What they claimed to find was horrifying. According to their accounts, the bodies they unearthed were undecayed. Some even appeared flushed with color, as though still alive. Their mouths were wet with blood. To the villagers, there could be only one explanation. These were vampires, rising at night to feed on their families. The rituals were carried out without hesitation. Stakes were driven through the corpses, heads were removed, bodies were burned until only ash remained. But as more villagers fell sick, more graves were opened. The process repeated again and again. Over the course of weeks, dozens of bodies were dug up and destroyed. Imagine living through this. Each night, you wonder if you'll hear a knock at your door. Each day, you wonder who will fall ill next. When a neighbor dies, you don't just grieve, you fear what they'll become. The graveyard became the center of life in Medvegia. Every funeral carried suspicion. Every burial was only temporary. Villagers watched one another for signs of weakness, convinced that death was not final. Fear divided the community. No one could trust anyone else. A sickness was no longer just a sickness. A death was no longer just a death. Everything was part of the vampire plague. The events in Medvegia did not stay hidden. News of the exhumations spread to surrounding villages. Travelers carried the stories further until the panic became a regional problem. What had begun as local superstition was now impossible for the authorities to ignore. The Habsburg Empire prided itself on order. Reports of peasants mutilating corpses threatened that image. If whole villages were gripped by fear, if graves were being opened and burned, it became not just a folk belief, but a matter of governance. Soon, officials would arrive, and with them, Europe's first scientific investigation into vampires. Later accounts describe what villagers said they found: corpses with blood in their mouths, bodies that groaned when pierced with stakes, eyes that seemed to glisten. For us, decomposition explains this. Gas escaping from a bloated body can sound like a groan. Purge fluid can seep from the mouth, looking like fresh blood. Rigor mortis, and then relaxation of muscles, can twist a corpse's face into an eerie smile. But for the villagers, these details were not signs of rot. They were proof that the dead walked. And once the dead were accused, there was only one verdict. The body had to be destroyed. By now, what had begun with Arnold Paole had spread through Medvegia like wildfire. The villagers claimed that as many as a dozen corpses had been discovered in this state. Some accounts place the number even higher. Each new exhumation confirmed their worst fears. The vampire was not just one man. It was a contagion, a curse that could spread from neighbor to neighbor, family to family. The epidemic of 1725 was unlike anything Europe had seen before, and it was not over. The villagers had done all they could. They had opened the graves, staked the bodies, burned the remains. Yet the fear persisted, and so the matter passed beyond them. The Austrian authorities would take notice. Doctors and officials would be sent to record what was happening. And when they opened the graves for themselves, they would write reports that terrified all of Europe. The vampire panic in Medvegia had spiraled far beyond the control of its people. Graves had been opened. Corpses had been mutilated and burned. Entire families had accused their dead of returning to feed upon them. For the villagers, this was a matter of survival. For the authorities of the Habsburg Empire, it was a problem of order. The Habsburgs ruled over a vast and fragile domain. They valued control, discipline, and faith in the empire's institutions. Reports of peasants digging up bodies and performing rituals of destruction made the empire look weak. If villages descended into panic, it threatened not only stability, but trust in the church and in imperial law. And so, officials were dispatched to Medvegia. Among them were military surgeons, men trained in medicine, sworn to bring order through science. Their mission was simple: to investigate the vampire panic and report their findings. The first report came in 1725. Austrian officers interviewed villagers, inspected graves, and attempted to make sense of the hysteria. What they found shocked even them. When they exhumed bodies, they described them as fresh and lifelike. Some corpses were reported to have blood flowing freely from the mouth. Their limbs were supple, their faces ruddy. To men expecting to find decay, these were disturbing sights. The officers recorded every detail. One case described a corpse that, when pierced with a stake, emitted a groan. Another spoke of a body so well preserved, it seemed asleep. Instead of dismissing the villagers' fears, the officials unintentionally confirmed them. Their reports gave the vampire epidemic credibility. The panic returned again in 1731. in the nearby village of Kisiljevo. This outbreak led to the most famous investigation of all, the 1732 Visum et Repertum, or Seen and Reported. Austrian military surgeons conducted a thorough examination of the corpses. Their findings became the most detailed account of vampires in history. They described opening 13 graves. In some, they found bodies decayed as expected, but in others, they reported shocking anomalies: corpses with blood at their mouths, bodies with new skin and nails grown beneath old layers, hearts and lungs that appeared fresh, as though the bodies were still alive. One corpse, when cut open, poured what was described as fresh red blood. For the villagers, this was absolute proof. For the surgeons, it was disturbing enough to put in writing. The Visum et Repertum was copied and distributed across Europe. Newspapers reprinted its accounts. Philosophers debated it. Clergy discussed it in sermons. For the first time, the vampire was not only a local superstition, it was a documented case, filed by imperial officials. These were not rumors or tavern tales. They were stamped reports, written in the language of science and bureaucracy. And because of this, the vampire became something new, a subject of international fascination. Today, we understand what those surgeons were likely seeing. Purge fluid seeping from the mouth resembles fresh blood. The skin of a corpse can peel, revealing what looks like new skin underneath. As bodies decompose in sealed coffins, the lack of air can slow decay, preserving them longer than expected. But to 18th century investigators, these details blurred the line between life and death. How could a body weeks in the grave still appear warm? How could blood flow from a corpse's chest if it was truly dead? These were questions that medicine could not yet answer. And so, in their confusion, they recorded what they saw in terms the villagers understood: signs of vampirism. The reports caused a sensation. Pamphlets spread across Germany, France, and England. Intellectuals debated whether vampires could truly exist. The philosopher Voltaire mocked the idea, but even in ridicule, he admitted how widespread the belief had become. For the first time, Europe's educated elite was speaking of vampires, not as myths, but as matters of investigation. The vampire panic of the 18th century was no longer a peasant superstition, it was a cultural event. Back in Medvegia, the villagers lived with the consequences. They had opened graves, destroyed bodies, and watched as officials turned their fears into history. But none of this brought peace. For even as the authorities left with their reports, the villagers remained in their homes, listening for knocks at the door, watching their livestock, and wondering which grave might open next. The vampire had been given credibility, and once it entered the records of science and empire, it could not be contained. From these reports, the vampire would leap from the villages of Serbia and Kisiljevo to the imagination of Europe, and soon it would evolve from a bloated corpse in the graveyard into the most enduring monster of all time. The Austrian reports had done more than document a strange series of exhumations. They had confirmed, in writing, what villagers already believed, that the dead could rise and feed upon the living. But where did this belief come from? And why, when bodies were dug up, did they so often appear to prove the stories true? In the 18th century, the word vampire was just beginning to spread across Europe. But the idea of the restless dead was far older. Among the Slavic peoples, the dead were feared for their ability to return. These revenants went by many names: Upir, Strigoi, Nosferatu. In Greece, they were called the Vrekolakas. In Germany, the Nachtzehrer. Each culture had its own version, but the pattern was the same. The dead were never entirely gone. If something went wrong in the burial, if rituals were not followed, or if the person had lived badly, the grave could not hold them. In Serbia, where Arnold Paole lived, villagers believed especially in the danger of a bad death. A man who died violently, who did not confess his sins, or who carried a curse, could not rest peacefully. Paole fit all these categories. He had been marked by a vampire in Greece, and he had died suddenly in an accident. He was the perfect candidate to become one of the restless dead. To prevent such fates, villagers used protective rituals. Archaeologists today have found graves across Eastern Europe with strange additions. Stones pressed onto the chest of the corpse, meant to pin it down. Sickles placed across the neck, to cut off the head if the body rose. Bricks jammed into mouths to keep the corpse from biting. Coins placed under tongues to stop the jaws from opening. In some cases, bodies were buried face down, so that if they rose, they would dig deeper into the earth instead of clawing upward. These practices might sound brutal, but they were born of fear. A grave was not just a resting place, it was a door that might open again. When Paole and others were exhumed, the villagers described signs that, to them, could only mean vampirism. Bodies looked fresh, even after weeks in the grave. Blood appeared at the mouth. Skin looked ruddy and full. Some corpses seemed to groan or move when staked. Each of these details matches what modern science calls natural decomposition. In sealed coffins, oxygen is limited. Decay can slow, preserving the body longer than expected. Gases build up, bloating the corpse and pushing fluids from the mouth and nose. Skin shrinks back, making hair and nails appear to grow. When a body is pierced, those gases escape with a sound, what to villagers sounded like a dying groan. But without that knowledge, every sign seemed like proof. Imagine standing in a graveyard, torch in hand, surrounded by your neighbors. The coffin lid is lifted, and inside is not a rotting corpse, but a body that looks alive. Its cheeks are full, its lips are red, its mouth is wet with blood. Would you think of decomposition, or of the vampire? Another important belief was that vampirism spread like disease. The dead who fed on the living could pass their condition on. Their victims, when they died, would rise as vampires themselves. This idea explains why fear spread so quickly. Every new death was not just a tragedy, it was a potential new monster. Paole's supposed victims were exhumed because villagers believed he had infected them, and when those bodies were also found fresh and bloody, it only confirmed the suspicion. What began as one man's death became an epidemic, not of disease, but of belief. When Austrian surgeons reported these details, they did so with the language of science. They did not say, "The villagers believe." They said, "We found bodies with blood at their mouths." For readers across Europe, these words carried weight. It was one thing for peasants to claim their dead had risen. It was another for military officials to describe it in official documents. The vampire was now both folklore and fact, and it entered the European imagination with a power it had never had before. At its core, the vampire panic was a collision between folklore and misunderstanding. Villagers brought their fears. Bodies offered their unsettling signs. Officials provided their authority. Together, they created a monster that seemed undeniable. It's easy for us, centuries later, to dismiss it all, to say they were ignorant, that they mistook rot for life. But fear is not erased by explanation. Even if we can account for the blood at the mouth or the groan of a pierced body, the villagers of Medvegia lived with a reality where these signs meant danger. And in their minds, the danger was very real. From these graves, from these rituals, from these misunderstandings, the vampire took shape. But the story does not end in the villages of Serbia. Once the reports spread, the vampire began to change. No longer just a bloated corpse in a coffin, it would evolve into something far more enduring. From folklore to literature, from superstition to symbol, the vampire was about to become immortal. The graveyards of Serbia were a world away from the candlelit salons of Europe's cities. Yet the reports from Medvegia and later Kisiljevo traveled far. Pamphlets were printed. Newspapers carried the grisly details. By the mid-18th century, the word vampire was on the lips of scholars, clergy, and ordinary people alike. From those shallow graves, the vampire stepped onto the stage of European culture, and once there, it would never leave. In the decades after the Austrian reports, vampires became a subject of debate across Europe. Philosophers like Voltaire mocked the idea, but in mocking it, spread it further. The Catholic Church investigated claims. Doctors wrote treatises attempting to explain the phenomenon. To the educated elite, the vampire panic revealed the superstitions of the rural poor. But it also fascinated them. If peasants could believe their neighbors were returning from the dead, what did that say about the thin line between myth and reality? The vampire became a subject not just of fear, but of curiosity. By the early 19th century, Europe was changing. The Enlightenment had emphasized science, but Romanticism brought fascination with the strange, the Gothic, and the supernatural. It was in this climate that the vampire found its first true home in literature. In 1819, John Polidori published The Vampire. Written during the famous Haunted Summer of 1816, the same gathering that produced Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Polidori's tale transformed the vampire. No longer a bloated corpse in a Serbian graveyard, his vampire was Lord Ruthven, pale, aristocratic, seductive, and cruel. This was a revolution. The vampire was no longer a peasant's fear. It was a figure of high society, a predator hidden in plain sight. In 1872, Sheridan Le Fanu published Carmilla, the story of a mysterious young woman who befriends and preys upon another girl. Here, the vampire was given an erotic charge, a symbol not just of death, but of desire. Carmilla introduced themes that would echo through vampire stories forever: intimacy, secrecy, the blurred line between love and predation. It also made the vampire female, showing that the monster could take many forms. Finally, in 1897, Bram Stoker's Dracula cemented the vampire's place in the modern imagination. Count Dracula was everything the villagers of Medvegia would not have recognized. He was intelligent, cunning, and charismatic. He lived not in a shallow grave, but in a castle. He was both ancient and modern, feeding in the shadows of gaslit London. Yet the roots of Stoker's Dracula trace back to Arnold Paole and the reports of Medvegia, the obsession with blood, the fear of contagion, the idea of the vampire epidemic. These themes were drawn directly from the cases that had terrified Europe a century before. Stoker gave those fears a new body, one that has endured ever since. What had changed was not only the appearance of the vampire, but its meaning. In Medvegia, the vampire was a neighbor, a corpse that refused to rot. It symbolized disease, decay, and the failure of burial rituals. In 19th century literature, the vampire became something more. It was a symbol of forbidden sexuality, of aristocratic power, of the corruption hidden beneath civility. Where peasants saw fear of their graves, readers in London and Paris saw fear of their own society. This transformation made the vampire powerful beyond folklore. It became a mirror for human anxieties. About death, yes, but also about desire, power, and the stranger who lives among us. It is easy to forget the man at the center of this story. Arnold Paole was not a count, nor a seducer, nor an immortal. He was a soldier who claimed he had once been cursed. He died suddenly in an accident in a poor Serbian village, and yet, because of him, graves were opened, bodies were burned, reports were written. And from those reports, a legend was born. Without Paole, there might still have been vampires, but it was his case, and the panic it sparked, that gave the vampire its first true foothold in European consciousness. From Paole's grave, Dracula would one day rise. The vampire has changed many times since those days, from peasant revenant to literary aristocrat to Hollywood monster, but the root remains the same, a fear that the grave cannot hold, and as long as we bury our dead, that fear will remain. The vampire has worn many faces. In Medvegia, it was a soldier who died too suddenly. In Greece, it was the Vrikolakas, swollen and ruddy in its coffin. In the pages of literature, it became aristocrats and seducers. And in our modern world, it lingers on in novels, films, and endless retellings. But behind all of these faces lies a single truth. The vampire is not only about the dead, it is about us. For the people of Medvegia, the vampire was a way of explaining what they saw but could not understand. A body that looked too fresh, a mouth stained with blood, a sudden death that spread through a family like contagion. To them, this was not biology. It was not science. It was evidence that the dead were restless. Fear filled in the gaps that knowledge could not, and that fear gave birth to a legend that has outlived kings and empires. The vampire did not remain in the graveyards of Serbia. It grew and changed with each retelling. From Arnold Paole's curse in the 1720s, to the Austrian surgeon's reports, to the salons of London and Paris, to the Gothic castles of fiction. Each generation reshaped the vampire into what it most feared. For peasants, it was disease and hunger. For aristocrats, it was power and corruption. For Victorians, it was sexuality and the stranger who walked among them. And for us, perhaps, it is immortality, the fear that we might never escape the past, and the desire that some part of us might live forever. It is worth remembering that Arnold Paole was real. He was not a count, nor a monster. He was a man who told a story of being cursed, who died in an accident, and who became, against his will, the center of a legend. His grave was opened. His body was staked. His name was carried across Europe as the first official vampire. And though he has long since turned to ash, his story endures. The vampire of Medvegia still walks with us. Not in the lanes of the village, but in the books we read, the films we watch, and the nightmares we whisper about in the dark. Tonight, we have followed the trail of Arnold Paole, from his life as a soldier to his sudden death to the epidemic that turned his village upside down. We have seen how fear transformed him into a monster, how reports gave that fear credibility, and how his story became the seed of the modern vampire. This was not a myth. It was a case. And like so many cases we explore in the Midnight Archives, it reminds us of something unsettling, that our greatest monsters are born from our own fears. Before we close the file, I want to ask you something. If you believe these forgotten histories, these strange legends, and these darker corners of our past are worth preserving, if you want to help us keep this archive alive, then you can do so by liking this video and subscribing to the Midnight Archives. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep opening the pages of this book. This file is closed, but the story of the vampire is not. As long as we bury our dead, and as long as we fear what waits beyond the grave, the vampire will remain.